Buddy, I'm Jason Parker. I'm the co-founder and president of Copperworks Distilling here in Seattle, Washington. We're on the Seattle waterfront. We have been having a lot of fun doing deep dives into production. So we did a big tour. We then talked about malt and Washington farms. Today we're going to talk about pretty much the central part of what makes Copperworks so different than every other malt whiskey distillery that I'm aware of, and that is fermentation. Along with the brewing process that we talked about last week, this is where the flavors really come from. So I'm gonna break this down into a bunch of little sections, but mainly we're going to be talking about yeast, what it is, what it does, and why it's important, and how what Copperworks does differs from some of the other distilleries you may be familiar with. So first question is, what is yeast? For the longest time, brewers and distillers were doing their trade without actually understanding that fermentation was being caused by an organism, a little monocell organism that grew and created alcohol and CO2. The original term for fermentation was simply one word, God is good. And that was to describe the magic that happened that converted sugars into alcohol. But we now know, especially with Louis Pasteur's work in 1850s and 1860, how important the yeast cell is. So first thing I'm going to do here, Ethan is running the camera, so he'll be able to take a look at this. These are dried yeast cells. We almost never use dried yeast cells, but I poured those out so that you can see what they look like. You may be a baker or even a home brewer, and you may recognize that as yeast cells. These are not individual cells. Each one of those granules has hundreds of thousands of cells in it. This is a yeast slurry. As a matter of fact, this was pitched about an hour ago. This is pitching means adding yeast to the beer. And this is what's in fermentation right now. I can't even put the cap on it tightly or it'll blow the cap off, or worse yet, blow the bottle up. So yeast comes in basic two forms, dried and liquid. We almost always use liquid yeast. I do sometimes want to experiment with some different strains of yeast, so we have used dried yeast. But we'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. So what does yeast do? It converts sugars. Not all types of sugars, but a lot of the sugars that you might find in fruit and grain slurries into alcohol and CO2. I think the alcohol is about 48.4%, and the CO2 is a little bit lower at 46.3%. The remainder of that is literally more yeast cells. So yeast is also growing and making itself yeast. Fermentation is really cool because it doesn't require oxygen. So think about all the organisms that require oxygen. You, me, trees, plants, animals, everything we can think of breathes oxygen. Yeast also prefers to breathe oxygen and respire, so it does respiration like we do. But when oxygen is absent, which is true in a lot of places under the sea, in substrates where something has taken all the oxygen out, yeast can survive by fermentation. It's a whole nother metabolic pathway to create energy for itself, converting sugars into energy without oxygen. And here's what's cool. When it does that, not only does it make alcohol and CO2, but it makes amazing flavors. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and so it's up to the brewer or the distiller to decide which yeast strain, and then all the conditions that they're going to operate in, temperature, pH, the amount of sugar that they're going to have, to create the flavors they want. If they don't like those flavors, a couple of problems may have happened. The yeast may have changed, it may have been a wild yeast, or they may have not created a good condition. So in fact, brewers are nothing more, and I'm going to refer to ourselves as brewers in the first stage of distillation. Brewers are nothing more than collectors of ingredients. We make a really good plate of food for yeast to eat. And if we make the right plate of food and we select the right room and conditions, and then we invite the right yeast, we end up with really delicious flavors. So let's talk about one of the things that separates Copperworks probably from almost every other craft distillery, and certainly every other large distillery. That is our process of brewing, in which we boil the wash. So we talked last week about collecting sweet wort out of the malted barley. We take that sweet wort and we put it in a kettle, just like any brewer would do. We turn on the steam and we boil it. That concentrates it. That means it drives off water and makes more sugar per milliliter. It also sanitizes it. It kills bacteria and it kills wild yeast. So the big differentiating factor in Copperworks is that we act like breweries at the beginning of this process by using a pure strain yeast. And the way we can do a pure strain yeast is killing everything else, all wild yeast and all bacteria, by boiling. Louis Pasteur taught us that, right? In 1860 we learned that. So by boiling, we then bring that sweet wort over, which is exactly what we did today, partnering with the Elysian. We brought almost 2,000 gallons of sweet wort, that is beer with no yeast, and then we pitched brewer's yeast. We're actually using the yeast today from the Elysian. It was collected right at the bottom of one of their fermenters. We'll take a look at fermenters in a minute. Right on the bottom of one that had Bifrost, so one of their winter beers. That yeast we added into the fermentation, and it's going to begin to eat those sugars. Before I get into, I'm going to have to look at some notes to make sure I'm covering everything, because there's a lot to cover. Oh yeah, a couple of other things. We do in fact use a pure strain of yeast. So we know that brewer's yeast, fermenters, distiller's yeast, and baker's yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Those are all the same Latin name, but in fact there's hundreds of varieties of them, of strains of those yeast. And each one of those strains operates in a slightly different condition and makes slightly different flavors. Some of them are radical, some of them are really phenolic, so they have everything from Band-Aids to cinnamon to clove or banana aromas. Other ones are much more fruity and floral. That's what brewers have been doing for the past couple of hundred years, is picking the yeast they like, along with the malt and the grains that they use, and of course the hops that they use to make the flavors. But it's not what distillers have been doing. For hundreds of years, distillers have not been optimizing for flavor, but actually optimizing for yield. Now you can imagine that 100 years ago, if you were making alcohol, the goal was to make alcohol. And you could sell your alcohol. It wasn't a big deal about how much better it tasted than your neighbor's alcohol, because all of it was going to go. So the important thing there was to make the maximum amount of alcohol. Well, some yeast are more alcohol tolerant, and they eat more sugars to create that alcohol. What that does is it leaves less sweetness behind, converts more alcohol, therefore the distiller gets more alcohol per pound of grain. There's sort of a factor that is used to determine the quality of a distillery, or I should actually say the efficiency, not necessarily quality, though they are often confused. The efficiency of a distillery is measured on how many liters of pure alcohol it can make from a ton of grain. And the gold standard right now is 440. If your distillery can make 440 liters of pure alcohol from a ton of grain, then you're at the top of the efficiency curve right now. If you are owned by a big brand and that brand has 20 or 30 different distilleries around the world, and they're looking at how to allocate brewing and distilling, they may decide to mothball the distilleries that can't hit that high yield in order to keep that yield high at some of their more modern distilleries. So everything is based on yield. Well, we don't measure our yield. And it's not because we don't know how to do the math. It's because if we did do the math, we'd probably be horrified. I'm sure that our yield is really low. I'm sure that it is not something to be proud of, except for this simple fact. We don't steer by yield, we steer by flavor. That's not the way the big distilleries are working. They're steering by yield. When we steer by flavor, then we get to decide which variety of yeast are we going to use and what conditions are we going to put it in. So here's two other facts. Most breweries know that the temperature and the time that the yeast takes are related. So the higher the temperature, the faster the fermentation, but the more off flavors. The lower the temperature, now these are within in boundaries, I should say, so you can't just go down too low or that yeast will stop. But within a given yeast, a lower temperature will generally lead to a slower fermentation and also commensurate with less off flavors. And by off flavors for fermentation, I mean things like sulfur, cooked cabbage, corn, diacetyl, which is kind of butterscotch. Those flavors can come from hot, fast, or also contaminated fermentations. We ferment at 70 degrees Fahrenheit for 7 to 10 days. Most distilleries, whether they're in Scotland, Ireland, Japan, making malt whiskey, will distill for 3 to 5 days. At the end of that time, since they have not boiled, at the end of that time, the load of bacteria that was nascent on that grain is now beginning to take over some of the flavors. So they actually have to quickly get that, what's now fermented wash, into the stills, turn on the steam, start collecting alcohol, and in the process kill that bacteria so they don't end up with a sour acetic acid or lactic acid flavored whiskey. To some degree, they do want some of that flavor, and that is by just historical experience, that is one of the flavors that makes traditional products taste traditional, is that they have those off flavors. We're not trying to make a traditional product, we're actually trying to make a whiskey that we claim from great brewing comes great spirits, and so the brewing has to be just as good, so does the fermentation, as we would do at any brewery. By boiling and then putting in stainless steel fermenters, not wooden washbacks, we also keep air out, we keep wild yeast out, we keep bacteria out, so we can do that 7-day fermentation. The next thing that we do is kind of unheard of. We do 2 more weeks of cold conditioning. Cold conditioning is just like you would do in a brewery, where you turn the temperature of that fermenter down so that the yeast drops out of solution. It will no longer look hazy like that. It'll actually look clear, like a beer you'd normally want to drink, other than say hazy IPAs or Hefeweizens. You would expect a beer to be clear. That process is by a term called flocculation. I always say it sounds like a cuss word, but you can use it. It simply means the yeast drops down, it flocculates into a cone at the bottom of the fermenter, where you can then crop that yeast and use it for next batches. The big distilleries don't do that, and they can't do that because they have started with a yeast that was already contaminated. They didn't boil to sanitize, so the bacteria load has even gotten higher. So as a result, they always have to start with a fresh yeast, and they will either start with a dry yeast or a slurry of yeast made specifically for them. There's negatives in that I'm not going to get into because there are actually too many to describe, but I'd be happy to take questions. Or we can also do questions online later, by email. I mentioned the fact that we use brewer's yeast. There is another type of yeast, it's called distiller's yeast. The goal of distiller's yeast is yield, the goal of brewer's yeast is flavor. Those two are completely different animals, and the reason we picked brewer's yeast is because we know that we can differentiate our whiskey, our vodka, and our gin, anything that ferments with that, by using that over what most distilleries are doing. Some of the flavors that we get from our yeast are expressed all the way through the whiskey, and other ones aren't. So let's just put this out there. It may not be obvious. You may think that most of the flavors in whiskey come from malt. Maybe you think most of the flavors in whiskey come from barrels. Those are important contributors to flavor. You may even think that the distillation is what adds flavors. All 3 of those are not as important as fermentation. Fermentation takes the base flavors of that malt and transforms them through metabolic activities of the yeast into congeners, flavor compounds. And those are what we collect in distillation. You can look in there right now. Barrett's doing some distillation of a whiskey. This is the last of the Baroness whiskey, grown on Joseph's Granary Farm up in Colfax, Washington. So it's the last of that batch for this year. Everything that we do then requires a selection of yeast to match the flavor profile we're going to go for. There are some problems that can happen in yeast. One of the things is that you can get a wild yeast. A wild yeast is a yeast that you didn't plan for, but it was in the air. Maybe it was even in the lab that you got your yeast from, or the sample that you got your yeast from a brewery. So it's always important when we're working with breweries that we're doing lab work to make sure that that yeast is in fact clean and ready to reuse. If it has too many dead cells, or it has wild yeast or bacteria, we can't use it. There's a type of yeast, it's called Brettanomycetes, which is actually a Greek word for British fungus, because it was first discovered as a yeast flavor contributor in British ales, high gravity ales. That Brettanomycetes is the one that's really classic. It's ubiquitous. It's in every brewery and every distillery in the air. And so it's always a job to make sure you don't get an infection of that if you don't want the flavors of horse blanket, wet wool, barnyard Band-Aid. These are flavors that make classic Saisons or classic Belgian Lambic beers, but not a flavor that we're looking for in the type of whiskey we're making. We're looking for much more of a high gravity ale. Think of something a little along the lines of a Scotch ale without any smoky character to it. There's some other problems that can happen in yeast. Yeast can become stressed, and that is the temperature is too hot, the temperature is too cold. They mutate because of the types of sugars that are in there. When they mutate, petite mutants is one type of yeast strain or yeast condition that's respiratory deficient, and it'll actually lead to a lot of butterscotch and butter flavor called diacetyl. You can also have, as we talked about, most yeast fermentations they go from respiration to fermentation. After all the oxygen is used in respiration, they're growing and building multiple cells. Then they go into fermentation, and the last stage of that is to go dormant and do that flocculation to the bottom of the tank, if you're talking about flocking yeasts like we use. So the yeast can also make other alcohols, fusel alcohols, and fatty acids, and esters. So one of the things that's interesting about being a brewer is that most breweries are drinking the final flavor that yeast makes. Distilleries have one more step, and that is distillation, where we then take the byproducts of that yeast fermentation and then run it through the stills to separate the flavors we don't want, collect the flavors we do want, and then mature those flavors into whiskey. So this is actually the most complicated bit of distilling, is being a brewer and knowing how to use yeast. I think it'd be fun for us to walk down into the cellar for a minute. We'll just take a look at the fermenters. I'll repeat a couple of the things I'm saying as we're pointing to the tanks down there. And then if there's any questions, we'll take those. Otherwise, we'll see you online next week. Why don't we come on down? This way. So, these are the fermenters that we talked about. In Scotland and in Kentucky, these fermenters would not be stainless steel. The real fermenter is inside this skin about 6 inches. So this is a double wall fermenter. It's insulated. And not only is there insulating between this outer skin and the inner tank, there's also what's called propylene glycol running through a jacket. That propylene glycol is how we can keep the temperature of these fermenters exact. So we set on these controllers a temperature, and then it runs through those jackets and keeps those fermentation's running at the right temperature. It's at 68 now. It will climb to 70 degrees, and when it hits 70, the temperature probe will tell the glycol to kick in and will ferment at 70 degrees. Now, once that yeast has done all of its job, that's when we can turn the temperature. We don't have one in conditioning right now, but we'll turn that down to 35 degrees. And when I talked about flocculation, the yeast will settle out of here into this cone, forming a blanket. There will be like a mat of yeast below and clear beer above. We use this thing called a racking arm. So what goes inside is actually a pipe with a curve in it. And we can turn that pipe wherever we want. We turn it at the top, we put a sight glass on here, hook it up to a hose. When we open up that valve, we'll see clear beer coming out. As we turn that valve down and get it towards the yeast, we'll suddenly see where the yeast cake formed, and we'll start to see yeast pulling up. Tilt it back up a little bit, and now we can bring clear beer through. At Copperworks, we do not repitch our own yeast. We're using the yeast from the breweries, but in the future, when we have our own brewery, we will, in fact, be able to crop our own yeast. That's probably so much about yeast that you wanted to know, or maybe didn't. Questions, I can take them now. Otherwise, feel free to email us if you want, or call us, or come on by. We're open Tuesday through Friday, 2 to 4, just for bottle deliveries right now. We don't have the tasting room open yet. Jeff will also be doing some more presentations on some of the new products that we have coming out. I think the one that just came out now is very exciting for us. It's a gin that has been macerated with plums, so we call that the plum gin, and that one's going to be discussed soon.
We do actually have a question.
Okay.
Skagit Valley Malting actually just asked, what yeast do we use?
So the strain of yeast, I actually don't know the number of the strain of the yeast. I used to, and the reason I don't now is that when Anheuser-Busch bought, InBev bought Elysian, they went to the Anheuser-Busch labs to get their yeast. They get their same strain of yeast that we've been using since before they were sold from Elysian, but I don't know what it's called now. But it is their house ale strain of yeast. We've also played with 5 other dried yeast, and I'll mention one more. Brewery yeast. We've used the Pike Brewing yeast. I like Pike Brewing's yeast a lot, but it doesn't flocculate as well. It almost has to have a centrifuge to be cleaned. So we've also used 5 strains of dried yeast in a series of experiments to learn about the efficacy and the flavors of dried yeast. So the short answer is we're using the Elysian yeast. Long answer is it does have a number. It's at 3 different labs, and all of them give it a strain number, and I don't know what that is.
And show them do we want to show them the log at all?
Sure. When Ethan is now helping a lot in the cellar and in distillation, and so he's been doing a lot. You'll recognize his initials there, Ethan Bratt. He's been doing fermentation logs for us, and what we're doing here is monitoring the curve of fermentation. We're watching to see every day that we are indeed hitting the original gravities and final gravities that we expect. This one is a really interesting peated malt, so this one is from Skagit Valley Malting and was from the Elysian brew house and the Elysian yeast. What you'll see is that we started with a specific gravity of 1072. We're down to 1011. So this one's getting really close to being ready to crash. Crashing is when we turn that glycol on and get it down to 35 degrees and capture that. Well, like I said, I would love to answer more questions. I'll be happy to tell you the story of how we picked the yeast or any of the weird experiments that we've done with yeast. But for now, I'll say thank you for attending. We'll see you online next week.